photo you see on this slide was taken by one of the Air America helicopter pilots, and it illustrates the crash site for reference purposes. During my first few seconds outside in the rice paddy mud, I remember seeing pieces of wreckage strewn over a wide area and one large piece burning in the distance, later determined to be the wing section where the fuel is held. My first thought was an overwhelming fear for the fate of those who had been in the cargo compartment below us. I also saw Vietnamese soldiers come running across the rice paddy, and we'd been briefed on enemy action in the area the night before, so I wasn't sure at first whether these were enemy soldiers or whether it was help coming. From another direction, some of the flight crew came running toward us from what was left of the flight deck. I also heard a plane go over and the sound of multiple helicopters approaching. You can actually spot them on this slide throughout the crash site. Some are in the air, some are sitting down in the rice paddy, etc. Apparently, the U.S. Air America group in the South Vietnamese military had been alerted to our issues with the plane, and they were waiting for us to come back to the airport. So they were quickly able to get to the area, the crash site. The plane had broken up on impact, as it was designed to do, in basically 4 large pieces: the tail section, the troop compartment, the flight deck, and the wing section. The cargo compartment had collapsed and disintegrated as we skidded across the wet ground, which led to a near total loss of life from all the people that were in that area. Next slide. This slide shows an enlargement of the troop compartment with the smaller forward end where I was located in the center of the slide, and the rear aft end onto the right edge. One of the loadmasters was gravely injured and lying on the floor, blocking a portion of the forward hole through which I had crawled. I remember thinking we needed to move him immediately to clear the way in case we needed to use it as an evacuation exit. I first realized I was injured when my left arm wouldn't work when I tried to pull on him. By this time, the young American boy I mentioned earlier had climbed out of that same hole, and he began to get really upset, saying, "We're all going to die." And I said to him, "No, we're not. Now you need to help me move this man out of this hole so we can use this as a way to get out." He immediately quieted down and began to help, but still we were unable to move the gentleman. Very shortly thereafter, the one uninjured flight nurse came around the left side of the troop compartment through the mud. She had climbed out of the emergency exit on the left side, also straight into the rice paddy. Even working together, we were unable to clear the evacuation route, but realized at that point that we probably wouldn't need it since the emergency exit was available to us. The loadmaster we were trying to move subsequently died of a head wound. As it was later told to me, he left his brace position just after the second impact. He used his utility knife to puncture one of the emergency slides when it began to inflate inside the compartment, threatening to crush the occupants. His unselfish actions cost him his life, but certainly saved many others in the troop compartment from being killed by that inflating slide. I crawled back inside the troop compartment through that forward hole. There was no panic inside the compartment. The children and the babies were dirty with mud, and some were crying, while others were just watching all the activity. I saw no injuries to the babies at that time, and all in my section remained securely fastened in their seats. A section of seats had been dislodged during the crash, though, and I did see one baby during the evacuation who appeared to have been strangled by a cord around his neck, and that cord held a bag of personal belongings and a name tag that was put on each one of the babies by the orphanage before they were sent to the plane. The American civilian lady I had spoken with earlier about her daughter was lying on the floor in the aisle. She was obviously gravely injured with major spinal and neck fractures. My mind was still trying to process the fact that we had actually crashed. But training took over, and my next thought was, and I'm sure the rest of the crew shared that same thought, We need to evacuate these babies and children immediately. I began to unfasten seatbelts as best I could with one arm and carry babies beginning in my section back along the aisle toward the open emergency exit. We eventually formed a sort of bucket brigade where I would unfasten a baby, hand him or her to someone up the aisle, who would then hand the baby to one of the loadmasters stationed on the inside of the exit to pass to somebody waiting on the ground, who would then carry them to one of the waiting helicopters. I learned later that one of the loadmasters from the cargo compartment had been partway up that troop ladder when the rapid decompression occurred. He was left dangling on that ladder over the open hole in the back of the aircraft. Some of the other crew pulled him up and saved his life. He was grabbed and pulled up into the troop compartment, and I didn't see this, I was forward, so I've heard this and it's just amazing. He had suffered a broken leg, but he actually used a crutch and some seat belts to splint his own leg. And then he stationed himself near the emergency exit, and he was the one who was handing the babies outside. I remember hearing him say loudly several times, "Give me more babies, give me more babies," as we all continued the evacuation efforts in the compartment. I was too focused inside that compartment to know what was going on outside. Later, I learned that the one uninjured flight nurse who I'd seen outside earlier had carried babies handed out of the troop compartment to the waiting helicopters, walking backwards to protect the babies and the children from the rotor wash of the mud from the helicopters and the rice paddy. One of the aerovac techs managed to take at least 2 babies to the emergency exit before he was made to lay down by another crew member, and we later learned that he had 3 or 4 fractured ribs. The medical crew director nurse also performed the same carrying activities outside through the mud until she was no longer able to stand because of a broken foot and some back injuries. She had to be carried to a helicopter for evacuation. I know the other crew members were working in the same manner as I was in my area, but tunnel vision really took over, and it resulted in just concentrating on the task at hand. Unfasten a baby, carry it to the next person up the aisle, go back, get another baby, and do the same thing over and over again. I remember feeling absolutely no pain during the evacuation activities. The adrenaline rush during an emergency like this just enables you to do feats of strength and endurance that you have no idea you can do until you're put into that situation and that emergency. I remember turning over all the cushions at the end of the evacuation efforts to make sure that there were no babies left after I found one under one of the seats. It comes to mind that the rest of the crew was doing the same thing as we made our final sweeps through the compartment to make sure we hadn't left anybody behind. The uninjured loadmaster and I, at some point during close to the end of the evacuation activities, retrieved some blankets to cover the injured loadmaster and the American lady on the floor as they awaited evacuation. After one final look through the cabin, this loadmaster helped me out the emergency exit, and 2 of the South Vietnamese soldiers helped me walk to a helicopter. One of the American civilian ladies accompanied us, and we each held one of the orphan children on our lap during the helicopter flight back to Tan Son Nhut. In little more than an hour and a half, the surviving crew members in the troop compartment, flight and medical, evacuated all 140 or so infants and young children from the troop compartment through the mud of the rice paddy onto the waiting helicopters. At the same time as the troop compartment was being evacuated, a search of the remainder of the wreckage was underway. One of the aerovac technicians, who was part of the original C-5 crew, and with whom I'd flown many missions during my year of flying with the 9th, was miraculously discovered alive in the disintegrated wreckage of the cargo compartment. He did survive his injuries. Once we arrived by helicopter at the Seventh-day Adventist Hospital in Saigon, I remember seeing mud-covered children seated along one of the walls. They didn't appear to be injured, but they were simply watching all the hectic activity that was going on in the emergency room at that point. The ER was very cool, and I remember how cold and wet we felt from the mud and the water in the rice paddy. My collarbone was broken, and I had a few lacerations, some singed areas around my face, and some rather large contusions on my back and my legs, but I knew I wasn't injured majorly at that point. So shortly after arrival, I walked around the hospital to find the rest of my crewmates and figure out in what shape they were and where they were. During these first minutes at the hospital, I also sought out the daughter of the injured American lady. I'd seen her in the troop compartment during the evacuation effort, so I was pretty sure she knew about her mom. When I found her, she was uninjured and as filthy and dirty as the rest of us. And her first question to me was, how was I doing? I simply put my arm around her, gave her a hug, and then I left and I never saw her again. Our medical crew members continued to function to the best of their ability, even at the hospital. I remember trying to help in the emergency room until I was kindly but firmly told that with one arm I would be of much more help if I just simply sat down and waited for treatment, which is what I did. For the first time in my life, I found out how incredibly difficult it is to change roles from caregiver to patient, especially in an emergency situation when it's all hands on deck. After quite some time, one of the ER doctors washed the mud out of my face and enough of the mud out of my mouth and enough of the mud off my face to make sure that there were no hidden injuries. One of the nurses then took me to x-ray, and then I returned back to the ER to have a figure of 8 put on my shoulders for my broken collarbone. And then they also applied some antibiotic ointment and some bandages to the worst of the lacerations. Somewhere along the way, I was also given a shot of Demerol, which made me really woozy. Eventually, I was put on a stretcher near the other injured flight nurse and designated for hospital admission. However, my intention was to stay with the rest of my medical crew at all costs. I didn't consider myself seriously injured, considering that there were some very serious injuries, and so I refused to be admitted. I have absolutely no concept of how long we were at the hospital before we saw a familiar sight. 2 of our 9th Aerovac group techs walking through the ER doors. What a wonderful sight they were. And we knew then that our squadron mates had come from Clark to pick us up. I'll never forget that one of those arriving techs walked up to us and said, "Would you girls like to go home with us tonight?" And I tell you, I'm not ashamed to say it, the techs and the nurses were all crying at that point. Then more wild activity began as we sorted out where everyone on the crew was in the hospital in various departments, because we wanted to gather everyone up to go back with us. The first C9 rescue crew quickly gathered medical information and condition reports on the more seriously injured, as well as on the crew members who had perished in the crash. I was placed on a litter for emplaning because the Demerol had made me so lightheaded I could hardly stand up at that point. It was at that point of being transferred from the ambulance bus to the waiting C9 as a litter patient that I truly realized on a very personal basis the importance of our mission and the profound sense of relief and hope that our military patients felt when they saw us arrive to render care and evacuation. There was no fear of getting back on the aircraft, partly because the crew were my friends and colleagues. But above all, I trusted them implicitly, and the C9 felt like home that it had been for the last 14 months. The flight nurse on this first C9 rescue flight was one of my 9th squadron mates and a close friend. She later told me the story of her flight. This C9 crew of 1 nurse and 2 med techs was an alert crew from the 9th Aerovac group at Clark on its way to Udorn Air Base in Thailand on an emergency mission. They were diverted in flight to Saigon to pick up what was described to them as plane crash victims. The C-5 and the C-141 missions that day were apparently classified, and this crew had no need to know. The first time the crew learned who the crash victims were was when an American embassy representative boarded the C-9 at Tanzania as soon as they landed and gave them the news. She remembers the two Aerovac techs on her crew saying they were older, experienced Vietnam techs, and they told her, "We can do this." She also remembers the grim looks on their faces when they returned to the aircraft with us survivors after having identified the body of one of our C-9 crewmates who had perished in the crash. She said that we were all so covered with mud that she didn't even recognize me until she started to take my vital signs as my litter was being strapped into the stanchions. She spotted the flight nurse wings on my uniform, brushed away a little more mud from my face, and realized that it was me. The shock and the stress for this crew was incredible, but they functioned as the competent and well-coordinated team that they were to get us all back safely. Little had I thought during my 14 months of flying that my last flight aboard this amazing aircraft would be as a patient. At the end of this very long day's events, of the 314 souls on board the C-5 when it took off 8 hours earlier, 78 of the orphans, 49 civilians, including 35 Defense Attaché Office employees, 8 flight crew members, including both mission photographers, and 3 medical crew members perished. 176 in total survived, including 7 of the 10 medical crew members. Most of the survivors had been located in the troop compartment with me. Among those friends and colleagues on the medical crew who lost their life that day was my friend Mary Klinker. She was the last female service member to die in the Vietnam War. As the facts of the event began to come out, it became abundantly clear that but for the pilot and the co-pilot, the loss of life would have been significantly greater. Both were awarded the Air Force Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor for, quote, extraordinary heroism, unquote, and other flight crew members earned the Distinguished Flying Cross. All members of the medical crew were awarded the Air Force Airman's Medal for, quote, a heroic act, usually at the voluntary risk of his or her life, but not involving combat, unquote. No matter the tragedy of the day, this is the story of ordinary people who, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, reacted in a professional and humanitarian manner based on the excellent training that they had received. Although heroic feats were accomplished all along the way during that day, not one of us on that day, nor to this day, consider ourselves heroes. For the next month after Operation Baby Lift, I was unable to fly due to my collarbone broke. And instead, I worked the Squadron Control Center, putting together mission crews, scheduling flying time, coordinating patient loads, etc. In May, my duty time at the 9th was up, and I rotated back to the States, separated from the Air Force, and joined my husband of now 46 years in Kansas City. We met at Clark shortly after I arrived, but his duty was up 6 months before mine, so he'd already come back to the States. The benefits of my decision to join the Air Force at the age of 22 are innumerable. I grew up very quickly, received the very best in professional training, was given and assumed life and death responsibilities at a very young age, and I gained recognition among my peers for my contributions. I met wonderful people all along the way, most importantly, my husband. And this will be interesting to most of you. As a small aside, 3 of the 4 flight nurses on that Operation Baby Lift crew were from Indiana. Oh. Yeah. Please move to the next slide. To the recognition point mentioned before, I was asked in August of 2018 to tell my story of the C-5A crash at the 75th anniversary celebration of the U.S. Air Force School of Air Evacuation at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. It was the first time I had formally spoke about the events of that day in 1975, and as if my speaking slot of 40 minutes wasn't scary enough, I followed immediately after the Surgeon General of the Air Force. She's a 3-star general and the first nurse to ever hold that position. And this is a picture of her. The audience consisted of the entire aerospace school of students, staff, and instructors, as well as all the visiting Air Force general officers and other dignitaries, and it was more terrifying than any mission I ever flew. But it was also a wonderful opportunity to pay honor to those who perished and to all the survivors who worked so selflessly and so hard that day. Move to the next slide. The military is not for everyone. It can be exciting, full of challenges, and downright dangerous. But Perry County can be very proud of its long history of service to country through military service. Thank you all again for the opportunity to tell my story tonight, and I'll be happy to take a few questions, but first, I would like my husband, he wants to say a few words.
I wanted to take just a couple of minutes to provide some perspective on Vietnam. Vietnam ended, the Vietnam War ended some 47, 48 years ago, and a lot of folks are not that familiar with it. But essentially, the American presence, the military presence in Vietnam started in 1954, just after the fall of the French at Dien Bien Phu by Ho Chi Minh and his band of communist rebels. The defeat ended up dividing the country between North Vietnam and the communists and South Vietnam, which was supposed to be a democracy. Harriet and Joe Leclerc were 3 years old at the time, looking forward to their 4th birthday party in early August of that year. The early years, 54 to 63, were basically counterinsurgency against the guerrillas infiltrating from North Vietnam. We had thousands and up to tens of thousands of troops on the ground in that time frame. But it was not advertised to the American public, even though we suffered through 1963, 416 deaths in South Vietnam. The real buildup started in 1964, after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and the air war began in earnest, and the troop buildups went from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. It peaked in 1968 at over 550,000 troops on the ground in the war zone. Harriet and Joe were graduating from high school by then. The wind down started in 1969 and ended at the end of 1973 when all U.S. troops were out of the country. During the 21 years between 1954 and 1975, an estimated 2.7 million U.S. service people passed through the war zone. Of those 2.7 million, the official death toll was 55,220. Of the 2.7 million, an estimated 11,000 were female service members. There were 8 casualties among these 11,000. Harriet mentioned the last of these was Captain Mary Clinker on the C-5 in April 1975. The other 7 were all Army officers, 1 lieutenant colonel, 1 captain, 5 lieutenants, all nurses, all volunteers. So let's go back to Saigon in April of 1975. On that fateful day, Harriet mentioned that 3 of her crewmates were Indiana natives. And she also spoke of being rescued by another lieutenant, medical crew director, who happens to also be an Indiana native. So I'd like you to think about that, reflect on it a little bit. We have 4 women, all in their early 20s, all aerovac nurses flying on humanitarian missions into a war zone, all daughters of Indiana families, all in harm's way. So I ask you, what's not to be proud of, all you folks in Indiana? In my own personal final thoughts, we're very fortunate as a nation to have mothers and daughters and sisters and aunts, and yes, sweethearts and wives, who have the 2 characteristics that are necessary to put on a uniform in defense of this country, our freedoms, and our democratic way of life. And those 2 attributes, of course, are patriotism backed by courage. Harriet?
Does anyone have any questions?
Maybe I missed it along the way, but what was the airplane hit by a missile?
No, the locking mechanism on the rear doors, and the C-5 has these big pedal doors in the back. They open up like pedals, and then the ramp drops, and you drive planes and helicopters and stuff up into the cargo compartment. The locking mechanism on those pedal doors somehow failed, and as we climbed to altitude and the pressure increased on the inside of the cabin, then the pressure was great enough that it exploded that latch, basically. And when it did, it really was an explosive rapid decompression, and the pressure was great enough that it took the doors and part of the ramp with it, blew it up through the tail section, and that's where all the control cables and hydraulic lines were torn out, basically, leaving us almost with no flight controls whatsoever. No, there were all kinds of scenarios that were put out there, that we were hit by a North Vietnamese missile from the ground, and that some plane shot at us or something, but it was simply a failed locking mechanism, sadly enough. Yeah. Anybody else?
Right here. Have you guys been back to Vietnam, and did you keep in touch with the 12-year-old boy?
No, I did not, and I have not been back to Vietnam, neither has Don. We've traveled in the Far East a lot, but we've never had a reason to go back to Vietnam. I would love to do so. But the 12-year-old boy, I was reading something in the last few days about, stuff that I was seeing online. I don't know whether this is true or not, because it came out right after the crash, and there was a lot of false information that was published. But what the story said, again, take it with a grain of salt. He was actually downstairs in the cargo compartment with his mother, but he came up the troop ladder to the latrine just to check out the area, as a 12-year-old boy would do. We were in for a 3-hour flight, so he was just looking around. And unfortunately for his mother, she wasn't upstairs with him. He survived, but I don't know what happened to him. Yeah.